At my son's graduation dinner, after I handed him the envelope I'd spent 3 months preparing, he stood up, raised his glass, looked straight at me in front of 40 people, and said I was the reason he learned to succeed despite his circumstances. Then he put his arm around his father-in-law and called him the man who actually believed in him. I didn't say a word. I folded my napkin, set it on the table, and walked out. But when my son opened that envelope 2 days later, his whole world came apart. I should start at the beginning. My name is Norman, and I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a high school shop teacher in Sudbury, Ontario. I taught kids how to use a lathe, how to read a blueprint, how to take something broken and make it work again. It wasn't glamorous work. The pay was decent enough with the union behind us, but nobody was getting rich on a teacher's salary in Northern Ontario, not with a mortgage and a kid and medical bills that had a way of arriving exactly when you couldn't afford them. My wife Carol passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, which is how these things tend to go when you live 4 hours from a major hospital and the waiting list for a specialist is 8 months long. We'd been married 31 years. She was the one who kept the house feeling like a home, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who knew when our son was struggling before he ever said a word about it. Our son is named Derek. He's 38 now, a project manager for a construction firm in Mississauga. He did well for himself, better than well, honestly. I was proud of him every single day, even when things between us got complicated, which they did, gradually. The way water damage works, you don't notice it until the wall is already soft. The problem started when he married Vivian. I want to be fair here, because I've had 6 years to think about it, and I'm not interested in being the bitter old man who blamed everything on his daughter-in-law. Vivian isn't a bad person. She's sharp, ambitious, and she comes from a family in Oakville where nobody blinks at spending $12,000 on a kitchen renovation the way the rest of us blink at spending $12 on lunch. Her father, Gordon, I'll come back to him, is the kind of man who wears a watch that costs more than my car and considers himself genuinely humble because he once took economy class to Phoenix. After Derek and Vivian married, things shifted slowly. Christmas dinners moved from Sudbury to Oakville. Phone calls got shorter. When Derek did call, the conversations had a new quality to them, like he was managing me, checking a box, making sure I wasn't going to embarrass anyone. I told myself it was normal. Kids grow up, they build their own lives, they belong to their families now more than they belong to you. Carol would have said the same thing, probably. She was always better than me at accepting the things you couldn't change. But then Derek finished his master's degree. He'd gone back to school part-time over 4 years, finishing an MBA while working full-time. I knew how hard that was. I'd watched him do homework at 11 o'clock at night during our video calls, rubbing his eyes, still getting up at 6 the next morning. I was so proud I didn't quite have words for it. The graduation dinner was his idea, or Vivian's. I was never entirely sure. A private room at a restaurant in downtown Toronto called Auberge. I looked it up ahead of time. The prize fixé menu was $240 a person before wine. I didn't say anything about that. It wasn't my dinner to plan. There were about 40 people there. Derek's colleagues, Vivian's family, their friends from the neighborhood. Gordon sat at the head of the table closest to Derek, which I noticed but told myself meant nothing. I was seated toward the middle, between 2 of Vivian's aunts who were perfectly nice but spent the entire dinner discussing a cottage renovation in Muskoka. I'd brought an envelope. Inside was a letter I'd spent 3 months writing and rewriting, and a check for $22,000, every penny of a GIC, that had matured the previous spring. Money Carol and I had set aside years ago and never touched. I'd written in the letter about watching Derek study at the kitchen table as a boy, about Carol's face the day he got his acceptance to university, about what it meant to me to see him finish something this hard. It wasn't a glamorous gift by Oakville standards, but it was everything I had that I could give. The dinner went well enough. The food was excellent, I'll say that. Around 9 o'clock, people started making toasts. Vivienne went first, graceful and funny, mentioning specific moments from Derek's program that I hadn't known about. A few colleagues spoke. Then Gordon stood up. He talked for about 4 minutes. He talked about investing in Derek's future, about believing in him when the work got hard, about the conversations they'd had over the years. He mentioned, casually, the way you mentioned something you've been waiting to mention, that he had arranged for Derek and Vivienne to receive a piece of land in Muskoka as a graduation gift, a lot where they could eventually build a cottage. The room applauded warmly. Then Derek stood up. He thanked Vivienne first, which was right. He thanked his colleagues, his professors. He said a few funny things that made people laugh. Then he got serious, the way people do when they're about to say something they consider meaningful. He talked about adversity, about learning to push through without a roadmap, about figuring things out on his own because nobody handed him anything, about the man in his life who had shown him what real ambition looked like. He looked at Gordon when he said that. Then he looked at me, briefly, and said that sometimes the most important lessons come from understanding what you don't want your life to look like, that watching someone settle, his word settle, had taught him to want more, that Gordon had shown him what it looked like when a man truly invested in his family's success. He raised his glass toward Gordon. The room was quiet for just a moment. Not long. People adjusted, recovered, raised their glasses with him. Someone at the far end made a joke about Gordon buying the next round, and the laughter smoothed everything over. I sat very still. I was aware of the two aunts beside me, aware that they had heard everything and were being very careful not to look at me. I set my napkin on the table. I put the envelope back inside my jacket. I stood up, shook the hand of the man next to me, nodded to the aunts, and walked through the restaurant to the front door. The hostess asked if I needed my coat. I said yes, thank you, and waited while she retrieved it. Then I walked to my car in the parkade on Adelaide Street, and sat there for a long time before I trusted myself to drive. The kind of cold that gets into the car even with the heat running. I drove back to the hotel on King Street, where I paid $190 for the night because I'd been planning to stay for the weekend. Maybe see Derek for breakfast. Maybe walk around the waterfront like we used to when he was young. I didn't sleep much. In the morning I checked out, loaded my bag into the car, and started the 4-hour drive back to Sudbury. I stopped for coffee in Barrie at a Tim Hortons off the highway that looked exactly like every other Tim Hortons in the country, which I found oddly comforting. I sat with my double-double and watched trucks pull in and out of the parking lot. 32 years of teaching. The house I'd owned for 28 years. The mortgage paid off the year Carol got sick. A pension that was comfortable enough. A son who had grown up healthy and educated and employed, who had never once gone without something he genuinely needed. A son who had just told a room full of strangers that I was a cautionary tale. I thought about Carol. She'd have cried on the drive home, and then she'd have gotten quiet, and eventually she'd have said something careful and true that would have made me feel both better and worse at the same time. She had that gift. I finished my coffee and got back on the highway. When I got home, I did not call Derek. I did not send a text. I put the envelope in the desk drawer in the room that used to be Carol's study, and I did not look at it for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, Derek called once, 3 days after the dinner. He left a voicemail saying he'd noticed I left early, that he hoped I was feeling all right, that the drive back must have been long. His voice was careful. Not guilty, exactly. Careful. Like a man who knows there's a problem somewhere, but hasn't decided yet whether to acknowledge it. I didn't call back. What I did during those 2 weeks was go through the filing cabinet in Carol's study and find a folder I'd put there, 11 years ago and hadn't opened since. It contained documents we'd received from a social worker in Timmins when Derek was 27. At the time, he'd been going through a difficult period. Job loss, some depression, a lot of anger. And Carol and I had agreed together that it wasn't the right moment. We'd planned to tell him when things stabilized. Then they stabilized, and we found reasons to wait. Then Carol got sick and then she was gone, and the folders stayed in the cabinet. The documents were about Derek's birth mother. We'd adopted him at 3 days old through a private agency in North Bay. His birth mother was a 19-year-old from Hearst who wasn't in a position to parent. The social worker's letter from 11 years ago explained that she had since built a stable life in Edmonton, that she had reached out through the agency in case Derek ever wanted contact, and that she had left her information with the file. Derek had never known he was adopted. Carol and I had always meant to tell him. We truly had. When he was old enough to understand, we'd said. When the time was right, the right time kept moving, the way it does. And then suddenly he was 20 and 30, and we'd been his parents for so long that the conversation felt less like honesty and more like detonation. I sat in Carol's chair with that folder open on my lap for a long time. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I'd expected to feel something sharp and reactive, the way I'd felt sitting in that restaurant. What I felt instead was tired and clear, the way you feel after a long illness is finally broken. Like something had been decided. I took the folder to the desk and I wrote Derek a letter. Not an angry letter. I want to be specific about that because it matters. I didn't write it in bitterness. I wrote it the way you write something you've been putting off for 38 years because you were afraid of what it would cost. I told him about the adoption simply and plainly. I told him about his birth mother, her name and the information the social worker had included. I told him that Carol and I had loved him from the first morning we brought him home, and that the failure to tell him the truth sooner was mine, not hers, because she had raised it with me more than once, and I had been the one who kept finding reasons to wait. I told him what had happened at the restaurant had nothing to do with why I was telling him now. I needed him to know that. The truth had been waiting for 11 years regardless of any dinner, but I was 67 years old, and I understood now that waiting any longer was just another form of cowardice. I put the letter in the envelope with the check. On the outside I wrote his name and mailed it to his home address in Mississauga. Then I drove to the curling club on Ramsey Lake Road, where I'd been a member for 20 years, and played 3 ends with my friend Douglas before I could bring myself to talk about any of it. Douglas is a retired electrician. We'd gone through the teachers' strike together in 2019, and I'd helped him when his brother died. He listened to the whole thing over a beer after the game and then said quietly, "Well, that's a hell of a thing, Norm." Which was exactly right. I slept better that night than I had in months. Derek received the letter on a Tuesday. I know because on Wednesday morning at 7:45, my phone rang and his name was on the screen. I let it ring. He called again at 8 and again at 8:30. The fourth call came just after 9, and I turned the phone face down on the kitchen table and made myself finish my breakfast. By noon there were 11 missed calls. Vivienne called from her own number at 12:30. I didn't answer that either. By Thursday evening, there were 23 missed calls between the two of them. Derek's voicemails moved through phases the way storm systems do. The first few were controlled, measured, the project manager voice asking me to please return his call when I had a moment. By the 4th or 5th, the voice had changed, tighter, less careful. He said the letter must be some kind of mistake, that there had to be an explanation, that he needed to speak to me directly. The later ones were different again. Quieter. In one of them he said he'd pulled out every photograph from his childhood and spread them across the dining room table, looking at his own face, trying to see something he'd missed. His voice cracked once, briefly, on the word photograph, and then recovered. I listened to every single one. On Friday I drove to the post office and sent him a short note, handwritten on plain paper. It said that everything in the letter was true, that I was sorry it had taken this long, and that I would be at home if he wanted to come and talk in person. I told him the door was open whenever he was ready, and that nothing between us was unsolvable, but that I needed him to come to me this time. I had spent too many years adjusting my position to make things easier for other people. The note took me 12 minutes to write. I'd expected it to take longer. I won't pretend the weeks that followed were easy. They weren't. There were nights when I sat in Carol's chair and second-guessed everything. The timing, the method, whether I should have called instead of written, whether I should have driven to Mississauga and done it face to face. Douglas talked me off that ledge twice. My sister Ruth, who lives in Sault Ste. Marie, and who has never pretended to think more of Vivian's family than she does, said I'd done the right thing, and that it was about time. Derek came on a Saturday morning, 5 weeks after I mailed the letter. He drove up alone, without Vivienne, which I took as a sign of something. He arrived at 10 in the morning, and I had coffee ready, and the folder from Carol's study open on the kitchen table. He sat down and he looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, and I could see he'd been sleeping badly, the way he used to look in university during exams. Not haggard exactly, just worn somewhere underneath the surface. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. "Because I was afraid of losing you." We talked for 4 hours. We said things we'd been circling for years, without ever landing on. He talked about feeling like he'd never quite fit the template I had for him. The shop class, the hockey, the idea that a good job in a trade was as good as anything else. He'd always felt that mattered more to me than what he actually wanted. I told him he was wrong about that, but that I could see why it had looked that way, and that I was sorry for the parts of that were my fault. He didn't apologize for the dinner. Not that day. I didn't bring it up. What he did do, before he left, was pick up the envelope from Carol's study where I'd left it on the table. He looked at it. He looked at me. "You are going to give this to me at the dinner," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He set it back down. "I don't want it right now." "It'll be here," I said. He nodded. He stood up, and we hugged in the kitchen doorway the way men our age hug, briefly, firmly, not quite knowing what to do with our hands. Then he drove back to Mississauga. He called 2 days later, just to talk. We spoke for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. A lease game, road conditions on the 400, a documentary I'd watched about the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory that I thought he might find interesting. It was careful, tentative conversation, like learning to walk on a leg that had been broken and set and was still healing. But it was real. That was the thing. It was real in a way our conversations hadn't been in years. He came back in June with Vivienne. She shook my hand at the door and looked me in the eye, which I respected. We had a barbecue in the backyard, and she complimented the garden, which Carol had planted and which I've maintained imperfectly but stubbornly for 6 years. I thanked her. We didn't talk about the dinner. We didn't talk about Gordon or the envelope or any of it. There would be time for those conversations, or there wouldn't. And either way, the ground under us felt different than it had before. Sounder somehow. I don't know how to end this story neatly, because it isn't neat. Derek knows the truth now. He's been in contact with his birth mother in Edmonton, cautiously, slowly, with a lot of long pauses between messages. He told me about it himself, which meant something. He said it felt strange and sad and interesting all at once, which I thought was an honest way to describe it. The envelope with the check and the letter is still in the desk drawer in Carol's study. Derek said he'd know when the time was right to take it. I told him there was no rush. Gordon hasn't been mentioned between us again. I am 67 years old, and I live alone in a house that needs some work and is on a street I've known for 30 years. And most mornings, I think Carol would be reasonably satisfied with how things turned out. Not perfectly. Reasonably. That's enough. I've been thinking about that drive back from Toronto for months now. Not the part where Derek said what he said. I've turned that over enough times that the edges have gone smooth, What I keep coming back to is the Tim Hortons parking lot in Barrie, the trucks, the gray sky, the double-double going cold in my hands. There's something about a moment like that, ordinary and quiet and completely outside anyone's plan, that strips everything down to what's actually true. What was true is that I had spent 38 years being careful with a truth that belonged to my son. I told myself it was protection. That's what parents tell themselves when they're afraid. But there's a difference between protecting someone and managing them, and I think somewhere in my 50s I crossed that line without noticing. Derek made his choices too. What he said at that dinner wasn't an accident or a slip. It was considered. He'd been building that version of me in his head, the man who settled, the cautionary tale, and he'd been comfortable enough with it to say it out loud in front of 40 people. That's a choice that has weight. You don't get to make a choice like that and have it cost nothing. But here's what I've come to understand about cause and consequence. It doesn't move in straight lines. Derek didn't become someone capable of that moment in one afternoon. It happened over years of small decisions, mine and his both. Every year, I didn't tell him the truth. I was building a house on a crooked foundation. Every year, he let the distance between us grow and filled the gap with Gordon's version of success. He was making a choice about what kind of man he wanted to be. When it finally came apart, it came apart all at once, the way those things do. The folder had sat in Carol's filing cabinet for 11 years. 11 years. And the only thing that finally moved me to open it was being humiliated at a restaurant on King Street. I'm not proud of that. A braver man would have had that conversation when Derek was 27 or 30 or any of the dozen moments when it might have landed more gently. What I understand now is that courage in the quiet moments, the ordinary Tuesday when nothing is forcing your hand, is its own kind of discipline. It's harder than courage under pressure because there's no urgency to lean on. You have to choose it from nothing. That's what I didn't teach Derek well enough, not by what I said, but by what I modeled. I was good at enduring. I was not always good at acting. There's a version of steadiness that is just fear wearing a sensible coat, and I wore that coat for a long time. What changed, I think, is that I finally got honest about the difference. Not just with Derek, with myself. The letter I wrote him wasn't punishment. It was a thing I should have done a decade earlier. Done now because I was finally more afraid of leaving him without the truth than I was of his reaction to it. That distinction matters. It's the difference between retaliation and integrity. And if I'm being honest, I wasn't entirely sure which one I was capable of, until I sat down and actually wrote it. Derek came back. That matters more than anything else in this story. He drove 4 hours alone, sat in my kitchen, and asked me why. Not why I'd mailed the letter when I did, but why I hadn't told him sooner. He was asking about my character, and he deserved a straight answer, and I gave him one. That conversation was the first genuinely honest one we'd had in years. It cost both of us something to have it. Things that matter usually do. Carol used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they behave when things are easy. It's what they do with the hard thing they've been avoiding. I think she was right. I just needed 67 years in a parking lot in Barrie to understand what she meant.